Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, ever merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be upon you, dear viewers. Welcome to tonight's lecture organized by the Talim Department UK. As per our tradition, we will start the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran. Can I request Mohid Hamid Sahib to do the tilawat and its translation, please?
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سابقوا إلى مغفرة من ربكم وجنة عرضها كعرض السماء والأرض أعدت للذين آمنوا بالله ورسله ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. ما أصاب من مصيبة في الأرض ولا في أنفسكم إلا في كتاب من قبل أن نبرأها إن ذلك على الله يصير. Now, translation of these verses of Surah Al-Hadid, which is chapter 57 of the Holy Quran. I seek refuge of Allah from Satan the accursed. In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful. Why then within one another in seeking forgiveness from your Lord, and for a garden the value whereof is equal to the value of the heaven and the earth. It has been prepared for those who believe in Allah and His messengers. That is Allah's grace. He bestows it upon whomsoever He pleases, and Allah is the Lord of immense grace. There befalls not any calamity either in the earth or in your own persons, but it is recorded in a book before we bring it into being. Surely that is easy for Allah.
Jazakallah. Um, Tonight we have the pleasure of joined by Dr. Um, Dr. Iqbal Sahib, who's the producer and the host of Living History on Voice of Islam. He's a former president of Bradford Jamaat, North Jamaat. As per the program, we request the viewers to type in any questions relevant to the topic so we can ask the guests the questions towards the end of the segment of this program. Now I would like to request Dr. Saib to um, start the lecture regarding the history of Islam.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Dear listeners, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you to the Talim UK team for giving me the opportunity to talk to you again. As you've been informed, I'm the producer and host of the Living History program on the Radio Voice of Islam. And it's been an immense pleasure to serve the Jamaat in this capacity. And I hope some of the listeners will have gone to either the website and listened to some of the programs, which I'll ask Wakar to share later on with you. Or at least you may have heard them as you're driving around London, because I live in Bradford and I can't hear them as they're scheduled and broadcast live. But I understand that in the south, you can hear them according to schedule. And I think Manchester in the northwest region as well, you have that ability. So I hope you found them useful and of some benefit. So today's topic is about the importance of learning from history. And I just wanted to share with you the inspiration behind the Living History program and why I take such a deep interest. And that's to do with the very first revelation that was received by the Holy Prophet ﷺ when he was contemplating about God Almighty, life, the world around him. And the first revelation went as follows: in the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful, recite in the name of thy Lord who created man from, normal translation is clot of blood, but actually it should say a clinging form, because that's what it's referring to, something that clings. So I would say, who created man from a clinging form, i.e. an embryo. Recite thy Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man what he knew not. Nay, man does indeed transgress, because he thinks himself to be independent. Surely unto thy Lord is the return. So this is Surah Al-Alaq, chapter 96 and verses 1 to 9. In this beautiful verse, two critical points are being made, which are essential to understanding our humanity, our origins, and our purpose in life. God Almighty is telling us as human beings through the Holy Quran and through this beautiful revelation that man's biological development took billions of years. And certainly when you think of the cellular development on Earth, it's, Earth's lifetime is about 4.6 billion years old, and biological life is about 3.5 billion or so. And all that DNA that's captured within those two cells that merge in the body to form the embryo and the new baby, capture that history of nearly 3 to 4 billion years. That's what the DNA is, a history of our origins. But for us as humans, real history begins about knowing about us as human beings, different to other animals. And that's about our written history. Of course, before that, there's archaeological sciences which tell us, the early origins and mankind's, etc. But the written record tell us about our history of how our different civilizations, how our cultures have developed. And that's what inspired me really to open up the Living History chapter in the program. And I'll go into some of the programs that we made. So in today's presentation, I want to make it quite interactive. So I will probably only spend about half an hour going through why I think history or learning from history is important. Then I'd like to open it up to an interactive question answer session. So I hope I can answer your questions adequately. So today I'll touch on perhaps a little bit about personal history as well, because that's so important for us, asking the questions: who am I, where am I, why am I here, where did I come from, etc. And for someone like me, that was very important, because I came from a very remote part of Kashmir, living on farmlands as the Sumerians or the Persians would have lived 2,000-3,000 years ago. No different, using the same fertile soil and the oxen and the sheep and the goats and whatever, and then coming to the UK at the age of 9. So it's quite startling. And those questions start arising from early childhood and into my scientific career and into my Jamaat service as well. But more importantly, I want to touch on the importance of knowing your history about your faith, your religion, your culture. And then it becomes important to know something about your national identity, cultural identity, which starts differing from your central tenets of religion, etc. But they are important to know. And then, of course, in a multicultural, multi-ethnic world, and in the new world that really the boundaries are removed so rapidly now with the a means of transport and telecommunications and being in touch with each other. So understanding other cultures, other nations, and other people's histories. I want to finish off with the view that I truly believe that Ahmadis are the best people to look at history, to analyze history, and to present it in an unbiased and fair and open and honest way. Because let's be honest, everybody has an axe to grind. If you're a European, which most history books are written by Europeans, you'd have a very Eurocentric view of the world and history and people and life, etc. If you're Chinese, of course, you're going to have very much Chinese bias towards that as a historian, etc. If you're a Russian or Iranian or whatever. As far as I'm concerned, Islam is a universal religion, and I think we all, as Ahmadis, believe that, and certainly as Muslims, most of us also believe that. Being a universal religion, there is no real boundary between one Muslim and another, or there shouldn't be, certainly. But then, of course, we should be proud of our nations where we live and even our ethnicities, etc. These are boundaries that we create and identities that we create. So Islam is a universal religion that tries to bond people together, regardless of where they live, where they come from, because it's religion at the end of it is about spiritual development, the development of the soul. Because once you die, your DNA stays behind on wherever it is on earth, but you move forward in a different life, in a different way. But understanding, our origins has its importance. So let me start off initially with the importance of knowing and understanding our faith. Most of you, like me, will have been following Hazur's absolutely fantastic and wonderful sermons. Of course, all Hazur's sermons are wonderful, but over the last 18 months to 2 years, he has gone in such detail about the early origins of Islam. It's been really breathtaking. And to hear that history from our Caliph and from one of the most, has been great. I know there are lots of books written by lots of historians and other people, but there's nothing better than your supreme head actually pointing to what really happened, how it happened, when it happened, and the inspiration that we should derive from these people who followed the Holy Prophet ﷺ. Of course, the life of the Holy Prophet ﷺ has been amply covered, by Muslims and by the Ahmadi Muslim community in detail. And every Ahmadi Muslim should know the details of his life, of his mission, of his challenges, and the real philosophical aspects of the teaching he brought through the Holy Quran as well. But then once he passed away, you saw the early response even of some of the greatest Muslims, like Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu, who just could not believe that he had died, and he would have cut off anybody's head if they believed that. But it was the wisdom of Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu who said, no, he has passed away, as other prophets have passed away, and get a hold of yourself. And these things are important for us to know. And then, when Nazur told us about the character of, say, Hazrat Umar Raziallahu anhu, and now, of course, we're covering Hazrat Abu Bakr, and it'll be fascinating to learn newer and newer things. But, the character and the fiery temperament of Hazrat Umar Raziallahu anhu, for example, and how he changed when he became caliph, and the sacrifices that were made by him at a personal level, and the way he guided the community. In fact, if you look at the overall 30 years of the righteous caliphs, there's nothing in history that matches the speed of spread of Islam, the conviction of those people who basically sacrificed their life. Even the non-believers of Mecca who didn't accept the Holy Prophet, the way they basically just wanted to become martyrs in the name of Islam, it's not easy to do. It's not easy to do in this day and age. No one is being asked to give away their lives. Of course, who knows, one day we might be asked to do that. But all we are being asked is to make sacrifices, financial and otherwise timely sacrifices. But just think about that period as Azur conveys to us, the conviction and the belief amongst the early believers, and how Islam so quickly spread. It took initially probably the greatest big empire was the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great. But, he took quite a number of years, and then his son Darius, of course, spent quite a bit of time covering that area. And then when you look at another great conqueror, Alexander the Great, again, over a 10-year period, he more or less covered that period, including a bit of Europe, of course, Greece, where he came from. But that only lasted, 10 years during his period, and then it fragmented into different parts. And then later on, when the Romans came, they took a long time to establish their empire across that region. But within 30 years, the Muslims had conquered a vast, a massive empire. And then, of course, the Umayyad Caliphate and the Abbasid Caliphate expanded the Muslim empire at a massive level in geographical terms. But then there was that contribution in terms of a civilization, the contribution towards the sciences, towards architecture, towards poetry, towards all the different forms of development, of really unifying different cultures, bringing different teachings from the Hindu culture, the Chinese culture, the Greek Roman culture, etc., and pulling it all together. So it was an amazing achievement, and we need to know all that history. So why is that history important? If you just look at what we're facing in the current world at the moment, we can talk to a Christian and say, the Bible says this is the background to the Bible, this is the Holy Quran, and this is what it says. But you won't find many Christians around who sincerely believe in the Bible and who you can have a discussion with. On the other hand, most of the Western world is enthralled by their achievements over the last 200 years or so. So they're very much nationalistic and Eurocentric from a cultural point of view. So they will, go back to the Greco-Roman legacy and how great the Greeks were and the Romans were, and everybody else was a waste of time. And then European Renaissance started, and we Europeans ruled the world, and we civilized everybody else. Well, when you start reading real history books, you will find out that that is a bit of a fantasy. Of course, Europeans have had a great 200 years or so, but other civilizations have contributed massively, and you need to know that. And then, you pick a discussion with somebody, and they won't look at the philosophical aspects of Islam. They say, oh, your religion was spread by the sword, by your prophet, by this, that, and the other. Well, you need to know why the accusation is being made and whether it's true or false. And most of these are false. And then, like some of the so-called Islamic terrorists, they take things out of context and they try to degrade Islam and Islamic teachings. And you need to know then the historical developments. Again, Hazur has shed light on many of these topics in his sermons, and there are plenty of books there as well. Then there is another element. Of course, we take immense pride as religious people. We take immense pride in, our faith, our theology, our books, our great scholars. But let us not forget, we did have some great empire builders as well. They had their faults, of course. All civilizations and emperors and empire builders have their faults because they want to accumulate wealth and expand their power over a larger geographical area. But on balance, when you look at especially the Umayyad and in particular the Abbasid period, there's very few civilizations there that can match what the Muslim civilizations did. And we should take pride in that, and we should learn from that as well. And when people attack the achievements of our civilization, which they are continuously attacking at the moment. So just to give you an example, in terms of the sciences and in mathematics, it was the Muslims who contributed and shaped the knowledge that was passed on through Renaissance to Europe as well. But at the moment, what's happening? A lot of current scholars, funnily, the scholars, Orientalists of about, 50, 60 to 80 years ago, they were much more objective and open, fair-minded. But many of the newer ones are belittling Islamic civilization, and that's for political reasons as well. So even when you look at mathematics and its contribution, the introduction of the zero, without which no science, no mathematics, no trade, no currencies could have been developed in the way they could have. That was done by the Muslims. True, they borrowed it from the Indians, But at the moment, what you're getting is you got Europeans bashing Muslims to say they were useless. They just copied the Greeks, and they even pinched things from the Indians, and then we refined it, made it great. And then you've got the nationalist Hindus saying, well, these Muslims, they just came and spread their message with a sword, and they took our mathematics and took our sciences and whatever. And I don't see very many Muslims standing up and saying, whoa, hang on a second, hang on. And that is not true. Even when you look at Al-Khwarizmi, who introduced the zero and algebra, etc., to the Western world. When he wrote his thesis, he openly in his first book stated the use of the Hindu numerals. He made it clear that I have taken it from there, but I've refined it, developed it, and modified it. And he modified it in such a way that it transformed the Muslim world, both in terms of trade and development calculations, as well as mathematical and scientific development. Sorry. But of course, now his name is just, you search on YouTube, which I've done recently because I'm writing a new series of programs for living history. It's basically, how the Hindus developed it, and then how the Western people developed it. So these things are important for us to know. Then I want to move on to a little bit about, why it is important to know about other cultures and other nations and what is happening around us. I recently did a 5-part series on the Middle East. I hope some of you had a chance to listen to that, because the Middle East was the cradle of civilization, starting from Mesopotamia, Sumerian, and Akkadian and Assyrian civilizations, then going on to the great civilizations, the Persians with Cyrus the Great, etc. So you have to understand that those people made some great contributions, and they're the ones that passed on the light to the Greeks. The Greeks were a relatively backward people comparatively to them, but they passed it. So Greece actually learned things from the East, from those nations. And then, of course, the Romans learned from the Greeks, etc., etc. But the Greeks learned a lot from the Persians. In fact, Alexander the Great was one of the greatest admirers of Cyrus the Great and Darius as well. And, the fragments of his empire basically consolidated Greek and Persian learning, and many of those teachings are passed on to us now. So we need to know the contribution of both the Middle East and Europe. But of course, there's the Chinese civilization. Probably out of all civilizations, it's probably the greatest, longest lasting civilization in history, in true terms, in historical terms. I don't mean in religious theological terms, because the Hindus would say, well, their civilization goes back many millions and billions years and whatever. I'm talking about historically documented, substantiated facts as well. So the Chinese civilization, at least 4,000 years old. Of course, the Egyptian civilization is very old as well, but the beauty of the Chinese civilization, it's still a continuous civilization that's carried on from that time. And so I produced this 4-part series on China as well, its history, its background, and through most of world history, China has played the greatest part in shaping the world, the greatest economy in every way, the most innovative civilization in any way at the time. Of course, when the Muslims met them, there was a different story as well, but you can follow that in my program as well. And then, most importantly, it's about understanding current China. A lot of the West now, of course, has started China bashing for a variety of reasons, and I'm not going to go into those. You should listen to my program as well. But the development of China over the last 100 years has been absolutely amazing, certainly since Mao and the Communist Revolution, and when the Europeans were kicked out, basically. But China was humiliated through the Opium Wars. And what China said when they got their independence, that never again will our civilization go through the same humiliation. And, they've been reshaping their nation. And over the last 30 years, China has taken 850 million people out of poverty. And they were well behind Pakistan, by the way, when partition took place, in every respect, in every measure. But But you look at China now as the second greatest economy. Now, you can argue about the role of communism and how bad they are and this and that and the other, but I'll leave that aside. All I would say is just look at nationhood, look at leadership, what it does for its people, how it alleviates poverty and serves its population. And then there's the religious and theological arguments as well. And there's also important aspect of Russia for us. Russia has had a very proud history over the last several hundred years, but its importance in relation to the prophecies of the promised Messiah and Mahdi should not be forgotten by us. And we should learn and understand Russian history as well. And inshallah, I'll be producing some programs on that as well, and what is currently going on in terms of the global conflicts, their background. And Azur does it in such a wonderful and diplomatic way in his sermons and addresses about the need to have justice, equality, fairness, peace, and peace can only be established through justice. And so we have to look upon that. Remember, there are Ahmadis who are Russians. There are Ahmadis who are Chinese. There are Ahmadis who are Americans, Canadians, Europeans, British, and there are Turks and from other parts, Africans to a large extent. And they all have their own interpretation of world history and their role and what happened to them and who did what, etc. So as Ahmadis, we have to have a global perspective. Of course, we're going to have some national bias because maybe as a British person, I wasn't born here, but maybe I might have some bias because I live in Britain. But I should do my utmost best to say that history, like religion, should be presented fairly and objectively, so that when I'm talking to a friend who's a Russian, they also understand that I'm trying to be fair. If I'm talking to a Chinese friend, they appreciate that I'm not being biased and just being brainwashed by one set of media personalities or opinion formers, etc. So it's very, very important that you read widely. And this is why the Living History channel was produced as well. Now, if Vakar could just take me to the webpage for the Living History, I just want to show you the structure for those of you who may not have visited the Living History webpage. As I say, if you're in the South, you're blessed because you can hear these programs, and you might get fed up of my voice, so I'm sorry if you do. But, it's nice. I often put a program on that sends me to sleep at bedtime. But no, honestly, you can have a good 1 hour session at night time before you go and remember all the great historical facts, whether it's the Greco-Roman cultures or whatever. So there's about 42 programs currently listed on there. And I've tried to cover as wide a set of topics as possible so that you find them useful when you're talking to friends. And this is also a tool for tabligh. Remember, I'm not doing this just so that you become fanciful historians. We are doing this so that if you're talking to Indians, you understand a bit of Indian history. If you're talking to Africans, you understand a bit of African history. If you're talking to Europeans, you understand a bit of that history as well. And it's got topics that cover the debates about our origins, the scientific debates that have gone on over the last few hundred years. It covers the development of languages as well. And again, the statements of the Prophet Messiah Mahdi al-Islam, with Arabic being the mother language of all languages. And when you look at human journey, how human beings developed and how they migrated out of Africa and settled in the Middle East, and then from there went all over to Asia, Europe, etc. It's fascinating to understand how languages develop and how they're related. Got a large section, as I say, in the Middle East and the ancient civilization, 4-part series on China from the Xia Foundation dynasty of China, 2000 BC, and then going onwards to current. Of course, big section on Islamic history, starting from the very origins, going up to the great Ottoman Empire, the Safavids, the role of the Turks, in particular with the Seljuks as well, how they came in, and how after the Abbasids, the Muslim empire fragmented, leading eventually to the great Ottoman Empire, Safavids, and the Mughal Empire as well in India as well. I say there are a couple of external professors as well who've contributed, one on Napoleon in particular, and he'll be doing another program on the French Revolution very soon. And just to finish off quarter two, I said I'll make it about 45 minutes. I'm just in the process at the moment of doing a 7-part series on the history of money and trade. Again, I believe that this is very, very important and topical because for most of us, money is important. It's not central to our lives, but it's important because, without money, you can't pay your mortgages, you can't have your car to drive around, you can't develop programs like Voice of Islam, etc. So money is important, but it's not our God. Our God wants to develop us in our spiritual development, and these things are useful for printing books or doing other things, etc. So money is important in different ways, and you will find out from the very origins of how money started, from crops, from cattle and markets, exchanges, up to the introduction of gold coins and silver coins, and the different civilizations, their rise and fall, and relation to currency and trade, etc. I've really enjoyed doing the research into this, and I hope you will enjoy it. So that we'll start recording those programs very shortly. So, and then finishing off again, look, I think it's important that you tell your children about the importance of history. But if they don't want to be bookworms and read about world history, then start inquiring about their grandfather. Where did they come from? How did their father and grandfather live? What were the challenges faced by each of your khandans in wherever you came from? And there's an amazing story to be told. From my own point of view, if I'm being honest with you, that's how the interest started. Because as a young child, I grew up without my parents. I grew without really any Jamaat structures or anything around me. And so I got influenced a lot by the media. And I really had to retrace and find out for myself of what I am, where I came from, why I came and was sent away. And from there, my journey in life started. I do hope to write a book out of this, so please pray for me that I can one day complete it. But my living history programs are part of my contribution to share some of that knowledge, some of that experience with you, and I hope you will find it useful. And if you haven't been to the website, or where you certainly can't get the broadcast live, then please do visit the website and send us some feedback. And I must at this stage thank my colleagues on the Voice of Islam team, Arif in particular, who's been a soulmate and contributor to all the programs. Our non-MD friend Mirza Amjad Hussain as well has been great. And of course, Yusuf Aftab has recently joined us as well, and Professor Amr Sharif. And our technical team, Shazad Kesser has been wonderful, and Abdul Rauf Sab, our studio manager, and Dr. Abid as well, of our web development team. So we've got lots of things we want to do. Pray for us, please, in success. And now I'll open it up to some questions, and happy to deal with them if I can.
Jazakallah, Dr. Sahib. Thank you for such a comprehensive lecture and introduction to the importance of learning from history. I'm sure the viewers must have benefited and found it very useful, some of the information. But for the interactive part and the second segment, I will pass it on to my to Waqar Ahmadi Sahib to lead the question answers. I'm sure there are quite a few question answers from the viewers right now.
Jazakumullah. Dr. Sab, if we just start with the question from Sheikh Rahman Sahib. He asks, how can the Islamic world learn from history and progress to become world trend setters? And he's asked for some pointers in the contemporary world to be highlighted briefly as well.
Well, the answer from us as Ahmadis is, to be honest, to understand what the Holy Prophet ﷺ said about Islam, the Islamic civilization, its renaissance and its revival through the Imam of the age. And that's the honest and true answers, understanding Imam Mahdi, and through his Khulafa. Clearly, leadership would be given, and the Islamic civilization would thrive. But most of the Muslim world has chosen still, after 100 years plus, to reject that. And I think they are suffering the consequences. Leaving aside the religious answer that I would give, but so look, all civilizations can learn, all individuals can learn from each other. And what makes a great civilization different is that they don't pride overtake them. The problem with the Muslim world is that they, they pretend to be too proud, living in the past all the time. And of course, it was a great civilization that did a lot, but that's all they seem to do. Whereas other civilizations, they've had a great past as well, but they somehow rejuvenate themselves and go forward. And I'll give you the example of the Chinese, because I have, despite the fact that they don't, communism doesn't believe in God, etc., etc. But if you look at the Chinese civilization, I say in world history, they've been the greatest, but they had 100 years of humiliation. And if you look at them from the time of the Muslim world, when decolonization was taking place, Europe was withdrawing to its own frontiers, and nations were becoming independent. Just look at the difference between China and the Muslim world. Turkey has been lucky because they were shielded by the Europeans and the Western world, and to some extent protected. Iran, sadly, has had a tough time. But you look at all the nations, they are struggling and suffering. And if you look, especially where there is immense wealth in Arabia and in the Middle East, you look how divisive each of those nations and each of those rulers are. And that is a big problem. On the other hand, the Chinese, as I said, they had the greatness that we did as well. But then they said, we're going to do something about it and become great again. And look at how they did it. First, they kept their heads down and said, right, we're going to develop our own nations. We don't care what you call us, whether you like or dislike communism, or the way we look, or the way we eat, or the way we dress, or the way we live, but we will develop our culture, our civilization in our way. And look at the way they unified their nation. Then they started learning all the new administrative methods and the new technologies and whatever. And look at them now, where most people believe now that China now probably has already overtaken America and most of Europe, even combined, to be honest, in terms of economies in the longer term. So, Professor Abdul Salam used to write some fantastic articles about a revival, and he gave an example of the Chinese as well, of a story Mao used to tell about the Chinese digging dynamite. It's too long a story, but there's lots of examples you can give, and one has to admire the Chinese and what they've done. Russians as well. I mean, a lot of people said, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, what a useless set of people, etc. But obviously, Rabi, if you remember, he said, don't think that Russia is dead, right? This is temporary, right? Russia will come back because it's been a great nation. It is a very proud nation. And certainly when you look at the two world wars, and including Napoleon's invasion of Russia, they've stood up against Europe most of their civilization's time. And you look at them recovering, how rapidly they're recovering. I also admire the Iranians, leaving aside the theological differences. So there's lots of good examples we can do. So some of the Far Eastern Muslim countries are doing better, but I hope Sheikh Saab will find those useful. But I'm sure we can, we can discuss more off the phone.
Of course. If we go to the next question from Faraz Ahmed, he's asking, and this is a personal question to you, Dr. Saab, which historian's works did you find most beneficial whilst researching Islamic history?
Well, one of the first books that was really useful was when I was browsing through our bookshop in London. And there was a book by Professor Azati, who was an Iranian. And it was called The History of the Spread of Islam. And it was an amazing book, honestly, really open. Philosophically and theologically, the Promised Messiah's books, they just absolutely blew my mind, and they transformed me in ways that I can't describe just in a short period. But when I started looking at history, and that book was amazing at such a scholarly level with reference, looking at all the different aspects. So Iranians have produced some great thinkers, even modern thinkers. Sayyid Hussein Nasser as well has been a great historian of science. So Professor Azati's book was amazing. And then, to be honest, I just started buying lots of books based on the references, and you can see my bookshelf behind is heaving, and I've got double the sizes on the other side. And I just love books, and I've bought, and now with the internet, there's just so much. So history just overtakes your life once you get into it. So I can certainly recommend lots of books on Islam. I've got tons and tons of books, and on world history as well. There's a lot. But you're right. You have to pick. There are a lot of biased authors as well. So you've got to know whether an author is fair, whether they have got a good standing or not.
Of course, Dr. Sahib. We have a question from. There is a question about your book, which I'll come to at the end. There is a question from Nadeem Rahman Sahib, who asks, do you think that Islamic history should be in the national curriculum, i.e. in the history curriculum? I think there are some aspects of medicine in terms of the Islamic contribution that's been made historically that is included. But do you think that should be broader than that?
I think it should be a lot broader than that, because even some of the fairy tales, you pick them up so much from the Arab writers and the Muslim civilizations, as well as even the Ottoman period. You look. I mean, quite often a lot of the great scientists, whether they were chemists, physicians, etc., are covered. But you look at somebody like Ibn Khaldun. Adam Smith is regarded as the father of modern economics. But Ibn Khaldun, several hundred years before him, had produced much of the thinking that Adam Smith presented in The Rise and Fall of Empires, the role of labor, productivity, etc., rather than just raiding nations and taking gold and silver from them. So he was probably the real father of sociology, certainly. And even economics, and he's another example. And then the poetry. At the moment, do you know who the number one poet in America is? It's Rumi. So, and Rumi is just one of the great philosophers, thinkers, poets of our time. So there's plenty of other Muslims who have contributed. I think not only in the Western world, there's an injustice in the Muslim world. So we don't do enough to teach our own children about our civilization. Really, I mean, that's the tragedy of it. And then when you look at the you look at the poems of the Prophet Muhammad Mahdi al-Islam and our Khulafa, absolutely amazing poems. But a lot of our children don't actually understand that poetry. So we need to do more to convey the importance of language and the contribution made by those thinkers.
All right, Jazakallah for that one. Karam Saab's signal just dropped, so I'm just going to pick one of the questions from the one he was going to ask. One of the questions which has been asked, how are the living history program topics are decided? I don't know whether he asked that before, but I'm just repeating. Here is back on now anyway. Let me just make sure. There was some technical errors. So if you haven't answered that, Dr. Saab, you can put some light on that.
So basically, I try to involve all my team members in terms of suggestions of programs that we need to make and any contributions they want to make. But ultimately, as producer and host, I tend to select a majority of the topics based on what I think would be important for certainly all listeners in relation to the world they live in, but more so the Ahmadis currently who are listening in. So I've picked topics deliberately rather than just keeping focus line by line, age by age, so that people can pick and choose and listen. But ultimately, inshallah, it will cover almost all geographical histories of major nations. And let me just read you the sort of aims and objectives, because that really tells you what we're trying to do. It says the living history looks at the great civilizations of the past to see how they have shaped our societies today. So notice my emphasis. It's not just about, some historical facts. I'm trying to pick things that will help us say, how did they do it? Why did they do it? What could we do? Yeah. So I'm going to read it again. Living history looks at the great civilizations of the past to see how they have shaped our societies today. We explore the works of some of the great thinkers and leaders of times gone by that have influenced the modern world, and we reflect on some of the ideas that have impacted our outlook on life. So that's in a nutshell, to be honest, what I'm trying to do. And as I say, as Ahmadis, I think we are better placed than anyone said. No, there's a saying, the victors write history. And that's the reality of life, right? And over the past 200-300 years in particular, the Western world have been the victors of the rest of the world, and they've written history from their point of view. I think one has to be fair and look at global history from a global point of view. And I think Ahmadis are best placed to do that. And if I'm come across somebody ringing me. And I think, I would, in 10 years, 15, my wish is that we have 20, 30 budding historians who can cover lots of different aspects of history, but from the new world order will be developed by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. That's what I honestly believe. So forget these other new world orders that have been proclaimed, etc., etc. We should do that, and we can only do that by being fair, open, honest, and just to all civilizations, all people, and cover the good things and sometimes the bad things as well, so that we learn from those.
On the topic of books, again, I will come back to the question about your own book, inshallah, at the end. There's a question from Wasim Ahmed who asks, because I think you've been referring to lots of books which we might call suitable for an academic level of reading. So Wasim Ahmed's question is more about reading aimed at young children. So is there a particular book about early history, I think he means more general history, that you might have come across that you think is suitable for a younger audience?
Unfortunately, I haven't. So I have a grandson who's 6, and I'm going to have to start searching some books for him. But that's a great question, and I think we need to do. Some small books are being developed by the Jamaat. I live in Bradford, and I think hopefully, inshallah, we will have a lot in common with history. So even the non-Ahmadis will have produced, I'm sure, some good books. So I can't point to any, but I'm going to have to start searching and looking, because that's so important. Quite often with my grandson, my daughter and I share stories, from Bible, obviously with the Holy Quran versions of them. But there are some decent books there about prophets and what they did. And then, of course, we refine that from an Islamic angle.
Yeah, Dr. Sahib, obviously you've, mashallah, told us lots about the living history programs that you've been researching on extensively. There's a question asking, are there any particular periods of history that you have actually found more challenging to find reliable information about?
Challenging.
I suppose that the further back in time you go, the information might not be as readily available, arguably. But is there a particular period of time?
I think that's part of the issue. And one of the areas that I found quite challenging is the legacy of the Greco-Roman culture, because even past history that has been given to us is by the Greeks. So Herodotus, basically, the father of history, but his history was combined with mythology and lots of other things. And then Thucydides, who was the historian from Athens, when you had Sparta and Athens fighting, and the Peloponnesian wars of Greece, etc. He was probably the most objective historian. So most of Western history of Greco-Roman culture was passed on by the Greeks and Herodotus and others, and then the Romans as well, including Persian history as well. So in my view, the early Persian Empire of Cyrus was one of the greatest empires, and Zulkarnain was the name given to in the Holy Quran to him. So I'd love to know a lot more about that, but the only sources are Greek. So there's very little you can find, or not enough you can find on the early Achaemenid Empire. And then, of course, about Islamic history, there is such a bias against Islam that it's difficult, and more Muslim historians. Of course, we have the early historians like Tabri and some of the others that Azur mentions regularly. But after that, probably Ibn Khaldun's. I've just actually got hold of his books, so I'll find out how thorough they are. But there's very few books that I found on some of the phases of our own civilization. They probably are available in Urdu, but in English, it's been a difficult struggle as well. But that's an ongoing challenge, and that's something that we have to do as Ahmadis: sift through who are the reliable and fair and honest historians, where are the distorted facts. And I think we will, inshallah, in due course, we will rewrite global history. I really do believe that.
Yeah, I think we're also seeing that in the current, very inspiring series of sermons given by Hazrat al-Masih, in which he is, as he's narrating the accounts of the Sahaba of the Holy Prophet Sallallahu he's also presenting various accounts of the same incident, and also being able to comment on what the more reliable accounts are and for what reason they are more reliable. I think that's something that obviously we as Ahmadis should continue. In terms of coming to a question about Atiya Khaja Sahib about your book, she asks, are you planning to write a book to consolidate all the episodes and series of living history programs into one volume, or is your intention to go even beyond that? If you can tell us more about your planned book, effectively.
I started my journey about 1991 in writing, and some of you would look back to question answer sessions, might find a number of clips where Rabi used to ask me about my writing, and that book was about the journey. I called it actually Life, Its Origins, Its Meaning and Origins, a journey through the worlds of science and religion. And so that's about growing up in a mud hut in Kashmir and going all the way to reading sciences and working for ICI and some of the biggest global pharmaceutical companies in the world, and some of the questions that arise as you journey through life about cultures, about science, about faith, belief, and all that. So one day, inshallah, that will still come forward. But that was my early writing when I started formulating my ideas. But I didn't find a publisher and I parked it. And Living History was really based on those experiences. I am hoping to write this 7-part series on history of money and trade, because I think I've become a much better writer. So I'm hoping to get Azur's permission, if I can, to turn it into a book to support the series, because that puts hopefully Islam and Islamic civilization at the center of how and why fair trade, honest trade, and expansion of civilizations can be beneficial as well. So, and then, yes, I will turn some of the other books from Living History into books. So please pray for me. At the moment, I just want to share my thoughts with you all as much as possible whilst I've got a few breaths. So may Allah give me good health. So we'll see how it goes.
No, I mean, just as you said that Ahmadis are best placed to teach the world about history, I think, mashallah, you in particular are also even better placed to comment on world history. And mashallah, the great work that you've started with the Voice of Islam, we all pray that long may that it continue. I've also just pasted the link to the page from the Voice of Islam website, where you can access those, I think, 42 episodes of living history, which are a real treasure trove of knowledge of history. And I think we should not underestimate or undervalue the great effort and work put in by Dr. Iqbal Sahib and his great team. So mashallah, Dr. Sahib, thank you so much, Jazakallah for joining us again tonight. I know you've appeared a number of times on our lecture series previously, and I think the love and affection there is for you is evident from the comments that we received from our viewers, who are very thankful and grateful for your insights and your continued guidance and advice in this very important area of studying history. And I think it was fitting that, mashallah, somebody of your caliber has the privilege, or given us the privilege rather, of being our first English speaker in 2022. And inshallah, we look forward to inviting you again very soon to deliver your next lecture, which inshallah we all anticipate. So jazakumullah to our viewers for joining us again for tonight's lecture. They will continue as we do every single week next week. So our next lecture will be an Urdu lecture next Monday, and then a week today we'll have our next English lecture, which will be delivered by Nisar Orchard Sahib, who will inshallah be speaking about his late great father Bashir Ahmed Orchard Sahib, and his love and loyalty to Khilafat. So please join us for those lectures next week. If I could please end tonight's lecture by requesting our respected speaker tonight, Dr. Mohammed Iqbal Sahib, to lead us in a silent prayer.
Please join me. Bismillah. Ameen.
Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.